Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today for this session entitled Tackling Tobacco Trash. How do we address tobacco product pollution? My name is Kira Hill, and I'm a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center in St. Paul, Minnesota. I do just want to give a shout out to my colleague Hudson Kingston for spearheading the Public Health Law Center's work in this area and for providing a lot of support in putting this presentation together. For those of you who don't know the Public Health Law Center, we are a nonprofit legal center founded in 2000, and we are located at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. The Public Health Law Center offers free legal technical assistance to communities, public health advocates, and other partners. We also publish on important issues pertaining to commercial tobacco control, and we offer trainings and webinars. We do not offer direct legal representation, nor do we lobby. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the difference between traditional and commercial tobacco. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to the environmental impacts of tobacco, but I want to clarify that I'm talking specifically about industrial scale commercial tobacco production. I am not talking about traditional tobacco, as it is still used religiously, medicinally, and ceremoniously in many different cultures. Recognizing the distinction between commercial and traditional tobacco is important to us at the Public Health Law Center because it directly relates to a concept that is front and center to all of our work at PHLC, and that is health equity. To us, health equity means that everyone has access to the particularized resources they need to improve their own health and maintain healthy outcomes. This means identifying systemic racism, ableism, and other inequities that act as barriers to health. This also requires moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach, as well as overcoming and removing barriers that infringe on fairness, human rights, and environmental justice. We believe that for policy to be effective, it must be equitable. Our goal is policy that improves the public health. This means taking into account the social determinants of health, adverse childhood experiences, and inequity in general. We consider it our responsibility to use our legal knowledge to bring justice to public health as we support our partners in reducing health disparities. When all people are healthier, the communities they live in are happier, safer, more vibrant places. So with that, let's go over what I'm here to talk about today, tackling tobacco trash. First, I'm going to delve into some of the background of the environmental impacts of tobacco, including those that extend beyond trash. Then I'm going to discuss briefly some of the environmental impacts of marijuana production. Third, I'm going to talk about potential policy solutions. And finally, I'm going to talk a bit about incorporating what we've discussed into K through 12 tobacco policies. Every step of the tobacco life cycle involves both health equity and environmental justice concerns. I'm going to delve into some of the lesser known upstream aspects of this life cycle. So specifically, the cultivation or growing stage, the curing stage, and the manufacturing stage. This image comes from a 2018 paper analyzing the environmental impacts of each stage of the tobacco life cycle, which I'll reference a number of times throughout this presentation. So let's talk about upstream environmental impacts. The impacts from the growing, curing, and manufacturing stages of tobacco production include deforestation, pesticide overuse and contamination, child labor, food and water insecurity, climate change, and mismanaged industrial waste. I'll be getting into all of this in more detail in a bit, but just to give you an idea of the scale and seriousness of this problem, when we talk about deforestation, for example, we're talking about billions of trees that are raised and burned every year. And when we talk about child labor, we're talking about children who are exposed to toxic levels of pesticides and nicotine poisoning from handling tobacco leaves. The demand for tobacco as we now know it could not have occurred without the mechanization of cigarette manufacturing and the invention of the cigarette machine in 1881. Now, global production occurs at a gargantuan scale. 6 trillion cigarettes are manufactured every year, and nearly half of that production occurs in China, though some of it still occurs in the US. Industrial tobacco is grown in either a very narrow crop rotation or in no rotation at all, and in a monoculture, which means there's a field of nothing but one plant. The manufacture of all those cigarettes every year requires, as you can imagine, a lot of land and a lot of tobacco. In fact, today's demand for cigarettes requires 7.5 million metric tons of tobacco leaf and 4.3 million hectares of agricultural land, or an area roughly the size of Denmark. Making way for all that agricultural land requires a lot of forest clearing. The images on this slide are 2 Landsat images of a portion of Malawi in 1991 and 2017, respectively. The dark green areas are forest, and the light green areas are non-forested areas. A 2017 World Health Organization report that I will reference a number of times during this presentation estimates that 70% of deforestation in Malawi is attributed to tobacco growing. In China, where almost half of the world's tobacco production takes place, World Health Organization estimates that 18% of deforestation occurs because of tobacco growing and curing alone. But the most damaging phase is actually the curing or drying process of the tobacco leaf, which still involves wood fire curing in many countries. And in the countries that don't use fire curing, they're primarily using fossil fuels like coal or perhaps in some cases natural gas. To get a sense of how significant this is, consider that a 1978 investigative report into the tobacco curing process estimated that 1 tree's worth of wood is used to cure tobacco for roughly 300 cigarettes, after taking into account that over 6 trillion cigarettes are manufactured each year, and even making the conservative assumption that only half of these cigarettes are cured using a wood fire curing process, this amounts to a loss of more than 10 billion trees annually for tobacco curing alone. This is important because forest clearing and burning contributes to global CO2 emissions. This is because forests are important carbon sinks, meaning they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they lose carbon reserves to the atmosphere when forest cover is destroyed. The burning of trees itself also releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. While we're still learning about the value of forests to carbon sequestration, we know continued destruction of forest cover for tobacco production and curing is contributing to climate change. With annual demand for cigarettes projected to grow to 9 trillion cigarettes by 2025, the threat of continued deforestation, which is a significant driver of climate change, is concerning. While deforestation is, of course, not tied solely to tobacco production, climate change poses a significant public health threat in and of itself, so exacerbating it due to the production of a deadly product is counterproductive, to say the least. And deforestation has other impacts as well. We know deforestation leads to drought and desertification, erosion and soil degradation, which in turn increases ecosystem fragility, loss of biodiversity, and puts important natural products and sources of medicine at risk. Deforestation is also concerning from a human health perspective because it can lead to the spread of disease. Not only do all of the effects of deforestation I just described cause food and water insecurity by damaging and degrading the land and water, but commercial tobacco growing also strains water resources and displaces food crops. Compared to many food crops, tobacco growing is a more water-intensive process, using twice the amount of water needed to grow a ton of wheat, 5 times more water than what is needed to grow tomatoes, and more than 8 times greater than what is needed to grow potatoes. The idea of growing food crops in lieu of tobacco is not unrealistic. In fact, in many countries, due to economic realities, tobacco actually displaces food crops. Tobacco actually displaces food crops. A 2012 article in the journal Tobacco Control found that tobacco farming often occurs in the best and most fertile regions of countries such as Kenya and Bangladesh, displacing the production of other crops like vegetables and rice. As I mentioned before, tobacco is primarily grown as a monocrop, which means the plants in the soil become more vulnerable to disease and pests that develop in the absence of agricultural diversity. In order to make monocrops grow year in and year out, they need to be treated with insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides, and pests become resistant to those chemicals over time. For example, DDT, which is a damaging pesticide addressed in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is often seen as having given birth to the modern day environmental movement, is still used in many developing countries to grow tobacco. DDT was banned in the US and in the EU after its use was linked to cancer in humans and the near extinction of the bald eagle. Other pesticides commonly used are a group of insecticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics, because they are actually chemically related to nicotine. And these have been linked to the decline of pollinators and can accumulate in plants and in groundwater. Pesticides are also damaging to soil microorganisms and aquatic resources. And lastly, many of the chemical pesticides, as well as nitrogen fertilizer used to fertilize the increasingly damaged soil, are hydrocarbon-based, meaning they rely on petroleum inputs and are therefore energy intensive to produce themselves. The use of pesticides also exacts a significant toll on agricultural workers and their families who work or live near the fields. Farm worker pesticide exposure occurs because the workers apply chemical pesticides using handheld or backpack sprayers without any instruction, protective equipment, or training. These workers are also exposed to pesticides in quantities, mixtures, and amounts that were never cleared for human exposure. The impacts of pesticide exposure on workers is not just a problem in other countries. In the US, due to weak regulations, language barriers, lack of training about symptoms of pesticide exposure or protective equipment, lack of enforcement, inadequate housing and sanitary conditions, and fear of retaliation, workers in the US and their families are also regularly exposed to toxic levels of pesticides from the tobacco industry. And perhaps most concerningly from a human rights standpoint, tobacco production in many areas relies on child labor. Child labor and human rights abuses enable the tobacco industry to evade $1.2 billion per year in labor costs. Human Rights Watch has published several investigative reports calling attention to this problem. Their findings call out giants like British American Tobacco and Imperial Brands for sourcing from Indonesia and Zimbabwe, where tobacco is a valuable export commodity and tobacco work is often done by children. And again, this is not limited to international tobacco production. Child labor is also prevalent in US tobacco growing, as well as the broader agricultural industry in the US, due to lack of protections for young agricultural workers. In fact, in one 2013 study conducted by Human Rights Watch, 75% of the children surveyed, who all worked on tobacco fields, reported symptoms of acute nicotine poisoning, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Many of those children also reported symptoms of pesticide exposure, with pesticide spraying occurring while they work in the same or nearby fields. Almost all child tobacco workers reported that employers did not provide them with health education, safety training, or personal protective equipment. Many children reported having to wear plastic bags over their clothing. And children are particularly susceptible to pesticide toxicity which can cause long-lasting health consequences such as cancer, reduced cognitive function, behavioral problems, and hormone disruption. The Atlantic and NPR have also done some excellent investigative reporting on this issue, and I have images from 2 of their reports on this slide. As I just mentioned, the tobacco leaf itself, unlike most other agricultural products, is poisonous due to the nicotine present in the leaf. An ailment known as green tobacco sickness, GTS, or the green monster, occurs because of nicotine exposure and absorption through the skin, especially when the leaves are wet, or from clothing that has come in contact with wet tobacco leaves. Children are especially susceptible to GTS, which can cause nausea, vomiting, headaches, weakness, and abdominal pain. Farm workers in the US are vulnerable to GTS for the same reasons they are vulnerable to pesticide exposure, specifically the lack of protective equipment, training, language barriers, and access to healthcare. One 2001 study published in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine found that by the end of the summer working in tobacco, non-smoking farm workers had nicotine levels in the body equivalent to that of smokers, which, when we consider what we know about the impacts of nicotine on brain development, is extremely concerning. So as you can see, the tobacco growing phase itself negatively impacts the lives and livelihoods of many people, and those impacts extend far beyond those we normally think of when we think about the negative consequences of cigarettes. The next step in the tobacco life cycle is the manufacturing stage. The true environmental impacts from this stage are difficult to evaluate because the available data is limited and often requires relying on companies' own self-reported information. Also, China's national tobacco company does not release any publicly available environmental data, though it produces 44% of the world's cigarettes. But even the company's own self-reported data does provide some sense of the scale of resource use. Altria withdraws almost 800 million gallons of water from wetlands, rivers, lakes, and oceans annually, and almost 1 billion gallons of groundwater. These kinds of man-made disruptions in natural flow patterns, as often occurs from surface water withdrawals, contributes to a reduction in diversity of fish and aquatic species. But the greatest contributor to cigarette manufacturing's environmental impact is energy use. China relies on coal for nearly 70% of its total energy consumption, meaning that much of cigarette manufacturing is coal-fired. While some US-based tobacco companies claim to have switched some of their facilities to sustainable sources, it's difficult to verify these claims. Whatever the fuel source, though, a significant amount of energy is necessary to fuel manufacturing cigarette facilities. For example, the Philip Morris USA facility in Richmond, Virginia is nearly 2 million square feet. It sits on 200 acres, runs 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, and manufactures 600 million cigarettes per day, requiring a vast amount of energy. Tobacco manufacturing also produces industrial waste. A 2015 World Health Organization bulletin estimated that in 1995 alone, tobacco manufacturing resulted in the production of more than 2 million metric tons of solid waste, 300,000 metric tons of nicotine-containing waste, and 200,000 metric tons of chemical waste, with toxic byproducts such as ammonia and hydrochloric acid. The manufacturing stage of tobacco production is also responsible for an output of nearly 9 billion liters of wastewater annually. In the United States, the Toxics Release Inventory, which is compiled by EPA, reported that in 2016, 32 US-based tobacco facilities released almost 1.9 million pounds of toxic chemical waste, 1.2 million of which was released into the environment. And 89% of these chemicals were released into the air. The top 3 chemicals released at these sites were nicotine and nicotine salts, nitrate compounds, and ammonia. In addition to the CO2 emissions from tobacco growing and curing I discussed earlier, there are also greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturing process. But the environmental impacts of the tobacco life cycle do not end with manufacturing. They include additional greenhouse gas emissions and waste resulting from transportation, second and third-hand smoke, resulting from consumption of cigarettes, and finally, they include the many, many impacts of tobacco product waste. So let's switch gears and talk about waste. As you may know, cigarette butts are the largest source of man-made waste on the planet per item, and one of the largest sources of trash in the world's oceans. And as highlighted by the study on this slide, the most common forms of microplastics found in the bodies of every Mediterranean sea turtle tested were not straws or water bottles, they were tires and cigarettes. Many people I talk to don't know this, but cigarette filters are made from cellulose acetate, which is a type of plastic. Cigarette butt waste is concerning for aquatic animals, but it is also concerning for humans. For example, cigarette butt waste is highly concentrated around businesses where cigarettes are sold or consumed, and there is high tobacco retailer density in neighborhoods of lower socioeconomic status, particularly in urban areas. The study on this slide that came out in October of 2019, led by a researcher named Jeremiah Mock at UCSF, also raises significant concerns about accumulating waste near schools, with the type of waste varying significantly based on socioeconomic status of the student population. So we have to ensure that corrective action on tobacco product waste explicitly and holistically addresses it in all zip codes. And this is even more important since the tobacco industry has started exploring its own litter-based PR projects that focus on individual action and responsibility, rather than larger scale government-led solutions. So why is tobacco product waste such a concern in particular? Let's just look at what's in a cigarette. This image from the FDA's Center for Tobacco Products breaks down the major components of a cigarette. As I mentioned before, the filter is made of a type of plastic that breaks down into microplastics and persists in the environment indefinitely. Also, there are thousands of chemicals in the tobacco filler and other additives, which are mostly not listed here, but include nicotine, ammonium, lead, formaldehyde, arsenic, and pesticide residue, in addition to a whole host of others. These chemicals have been shown to leach into aquatic environments and soil, killing plant life and aquatic species. Cigarette butts also continue to off-gas poisonous air pollution for days after they are littered, giving off, for example, up to 14% of the nicotine that an actively burning cigarette emits. And cigarettes are everywhere. This photo on the right is from June of 2019 on a Florida beach. Cigarette butts are the largest source of man-made waste on the planet per item, as I've said, and one of the largest sources of trash in the world's oceans. We've become collectively desensitized to cigarette butt litter, but once you start looking, I can say from personal experience that you won't stop seeing it. And just to reiterate, cigarette butt pollution does not impact just wildlife. It is also an environmental justice issue. For those who aren't familiar, the environmental justice movement began in the 1980s in response to the statistical fact that people who live, work, and play in the country's most polluted areas are disproportionately people of color and poor. This is not by accident. Areas that are predominantly comprised of communities of color have been historically targeted by industry as places to site things like landfills, toxic waste dumps, and industrial plants. These same communities have also been targeted by the tobacco industry. As I mentioned earlier, the type of tobacco product waste found at high schools varies depending on the socioeconomic status of their students. But tobacco product waste also accumulates near places where tobacco products are sold, which is disproportionately in communities of color and in low-income communities. And the burden of cigarette pollution is not small. In 2017, for example, between 35% and 65% of the 247 billion cigarettes consumed in the US were littered. So when we talk about cleaning up tobacco product waste, it's important to keep in mind that we are not just talking about beach cleanups. We're also talking about ridding tobacco product waste in communities that are disproportionately exposed to the toxic chemicals leaching from discarded products. We also need to keep in mind that tobacco product waste includes more than just combustible cigarette butts. E-cigarettes also contain plastics, in addition to metal heating coils, a lithium ion or other battery, and a liquid nicotine cartridge. And even new heated tobacco products like IQOS, which don't contain liquid nicotine, still contain tobacco, electronic components, and batteries. Importantly, e-cigarettes also contain hazardous waste. The Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, of the 1970s, followed by implementing regulations in 1980, listed nicotine as a hazardous waste. It is listed as an acute hazardous waste, which EPA defines as a waste that has been found to be fatal to humans in low doses, or is otherwise capable of causing or significantly contributing to an increase in serious, irreversible, or incapacitating reversible illness. Technically, this means that the waste must be disposed of and handled in a specific way. According to federal law, even small quantities of acute hazardous waste need to be carefully labeled, handled, stored, and monitored. And then they must be sent with a registered transporter to a special disposal site. So technically, while there are still state-specific nuances to how all of this works, liquid nicotine is still a listed acute hazardous waste and should be handled and disposed of like one. More recently, in 2019, the EPA confirmed that e-cigarettes are a hazardous waste in an official rulemaking. In that rulemaking, EPA found no reason to think that e-liquids are less dangerous than liquid nicotine was when it was originally put on the list of acute hazardous wastes as a pesticide, meaning it is still considered an acute hazardous waste. I'm not going to delve into the specifics of hazardous waste law in this talk, but what's important to keep in mind is that this stuff is toxic. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, please check out the Public Health Law Center's webinar on February 11th, where leading experts from PHLC, EPA, and state government will discuss the national regulatory and local implementation issues related to nicotine regulation and disposal, as well as address vexing issues such as THC waste. I do want to touch briefly on environmental issues that apply to THC waste, though. There's a lot of talk about when it comes to there's a lot of talk about the environmental impacts of marijuana production. I'm not going to delve into all of it, but there are a few issues that overlap with tobacco production and others that are unique to the marijuana industry that are worth briefly mentioning. Some of the impacts from industrial scale agriculture and manufacturing, as well as the waste created by packaging, are common to both marijuana and tobacco production. Also, both industries struggle with so-called greenwashing, which is the marketing of a product as environmentally friendly when it is not. Issues that pertain specifically to marijuana, however, include that 1, THC is a different chemical that poses different risks than nicotine. 2, there is no direct federal regulation of these products. And 3, there are mostly smaller businesses rather than multinational corporations that are involved in the marijuana market at this point. And as I mentioned, just like with tobacco, there are life cycle impacts stemming from the growing, manufacture, transportation, and of course, the use and disposal of marijuana products as well. From the agricultural standpoint, marijuana production has its own greenhouse gas emissions and wildlife harms. For example, a huge amount of electricity is needed to grow marijuana. And as a lot of electricity is still fossil fuel fired, that is increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Like with tobacco, pesticides are often used to grow marijuana. And because the products are still illegal at the federal level, these impacts are not assessed by the EPA or USDA. And with respect to manufacturing, there are unique impacts stemming from marijuana product production. THC and CBD extracts, which are used in edibles and tinctures and other products, are created using solvents, which are VOCs or volatile organic compounds, and they can lead to ground level ozone, which is a dangerous pollutant. In addition to the VOCs from the solvents used during the extraction process, cannabis plants also emit VOCs as they grow, which can contribute to nuisance odors similar to those from other forms of large-scale agriculture or processing. And just like with e-cigarettes and plastic packaging of tobacco products, marijuana products also have waste impacts. These include the potentially hazardous waste impacts of batteries and electronics, as well as the impact from the sale of plastic. And just keep in mind that even if you're in a state that doesn't have legalized marijuana, many of these impacts also exist with CBD production. And there are, of course, more issues to discuss in this realm, including significant differences in federal regulation of these products. But since that isn't the main focus of my talk, nor is it my specific area of expertise, I'm going to move on. I would recommend checking out a report on environmental sustainability in the cannabis industry that was published in October of 2020 by the National Cannabis Industry Association for more information on this topic. So now understanding more about the environmental impacts of these products, let's talk about some of the potential policy solutions. First, let's talk about upstream sales restrictions. We're familiar with the waste streams that end up in sewers, and many jurisdictions are rightly looking for ways to address upstream waste so that trash capture doesn't end up looking like this. This is a photo of what is captured in nets like the one on the previous slide. And you'll see plastic wrappers, a couple straws, a plastic water bottle, and a bunch of cigarette butts. This probably looks familiar to anyone who has ever walked along a waterway. It also highlights that sales restrictions to address plastic trash shouldn't be limited to straws and plastic bags. Again, cigarette butts are the most common form of trash on a per item basis in the world, and cities spend between $3 million and $16 million cleaning up a total of 1.7 billion tons of cigarette butts every year. Preventing the sale of these products at the outset is the cheapest and most efficient way of dealing with this problem at its inception. So what exactly would you include in a sales restriction? Prohibiting the sale of filtered cigarettes, which California has been trying to do for years with increasing interest over time, is likely the best place to start. Logically, this could also include things like small cigars with plastic tips and packaging that is not recyclable and that is often discarded, as with the packaging that is now used on very cheap cigars and cigarettes. There's no reason to stop there. These products on the slide are disposable e-cigarettes. They contain e-waste in a battery that will never be recharged nor recycled. And since they are marketed as disposable or daily e-cigarettes, a user will presumably be tossing several hundred of these a year, allowing toxic nicotine and other dangerous substances to leach into the environment. So local authorities can look at prohibiting the sale of disposable e-cigarettes just as they would filtered cigarettes. Similarly, cartridges or pods could be included in a sales restriction. The pods are not designed to be reusable, though teenagers on YouTube have demonstrated that they are indeed refillable. And these products end up littered around school parking lots and parks, anywhere young vapers congregate. They are full of toxic remnants and unused nicotine even after use. As you may know, the accumulation of these liquid nicotine products, cartridges and pods, makes for a lose-lose situation for many public entities like high schools and even courts and TSA at airports, really anywhere these things get confiscated. A sales restriction that would prevent these from getting into the hands of young people would have a large positive impact, both on public health and on the financial risk that is being imposed on entities like schools by the vaping epidemic. Also, sales restrictions, which would necessarily impact demand and thus production, is really the only solution that could best get at some of the disturbing upstream environmental impacts we talked about earlier. A second area of possible local or state action is hazardous materials or waste law. We talked a little bit about the regulation of nicotine at the federal level, but it might also be possible to include nicotine as a hazardous material requiring increased transparency and data sharing, even at the local or state level. Often hazmat laws exempt finished consumer products or smaller amounts of hazardous products, but local jurisdictions could designate nicotine-containing consumer products as hazmat. The benefit of this approach would be that it would help identify hazardous situations, and it would require clear disclosure of how much hazmat is on site, its characteristics. It would require reporting of any issues, and importantly, it would require posting of a placard that gives adequate warning to the public and to emergency responders of the type of hazardous materials, hazardous chemicals, or hazardous wastes on site. Fines could be imposed for failing to comply, and facilities would be required to get a certificate of compliance annually. Having a sign outside a vape shop warning of an inhalation hazard might provide a little more truth in advertising than we currently have. Another logical solution might be a deposit system along the lines of the type we see with bottles and cans in some states. Under a deposit system, there would be a fee that would be applied to the product at the point of sale. And when it's brought back to the retailer would be required to pay back the deposit and accept the waste. This could be applied to e-cigarettes or some product packaging, such as chew canisters, but it might be more difficult for things like e-cigarette butts. It might also not be feasible in some states, depending on state law. The logic behind the system, though, is that it does work to encourage product return, which decreases waste, and also increases the price of the product on the front end. Unlike with bottles, one drawback, particularly with respect to e-cigarettes, is that you'd want to be careful about encouraging people to handle and collect hazardous materials. You'd also want to ensure that products are being properly disposed of by the retailers once they are collected. Next, fire safety measures could reduce some of the injuries and fires that have been caused by e-cigarettes. Due to the tendency of e-cigarettes to catch fire and explode, the FAA and DOT have both placed restrictions on e-cigarette and e-cigarette battery transport by air. This chart has a few examples of burning e-cigarettes that have caused damage and injury on planes. Injuries are also not uncommon when e-cigarettes catch fire and explode. One study found that at least 2,000 people went to the emergency room for e-cigarette injuries from 2015 to 2017, which is likely an undercount since many people who were injured don't actually end up at the emergency room. And fires have also caused a lot of damage, including wildfires, house fires, and fires at recycling facilities, many of which have stopped taking e-cigarettes or e-cigarette batteries at their collection sites. Policies to consider to address these issues could be sales restrictions on dangerous products, as well as third-party certification of e-cigarettes along the lines of what we already have with fire-safe combustible cigarettes. Lastly, I just want to talk about outdoor use restrictions. Outdoor use restrictions, such as smoke-free dining or patio policies, city parks and beaches, have been gaining traction recently. Outdoor use restrictions aren't usually aimed at addressing product waste directly, but these policies do have the benefit of denormalizing product use and littering. As you can see from the photo all the way to the right on the slide, signage and denormalization isn't always necessarily effective to reduce littering. And it is important to make sure that penalties, particularly monetary or criminal penalties, are not imposed on the people doing the littering, but rather on the restaurant owners or those who control the areas that are supposed to be smoke-free. Simple warnings or alternative penalties are important to consider incorporating into these types of policies in lieu of fines or other penalties to ensure that the policies do not lead to inequities in enforcement. And of course, this is not a comprehensive list of every policy that could help tackle some of the environmental harms of tobacco products, but it is meant to provide some examples of potential options. So getting to the last item on our agenda, I just want to briefly touch on some ideas for how to potentially address these issues in K through 12 policies. As some of you may know, Public Health Law Center has a model commercial tobacco-free K through 12 school model policy. If you aren't familiar with it, you might want to check it out through the link on my slides or on our website. While the document doesn't address tobacco product waste because the requirements vary slightly based on jurisdiction, it is possible for schools to begin incorporating language related to tobacco product waste into their tobacco-free policies. For example, a policy could incorporate general language pertaining to the problem of e-cigarette and other tobacco product waste, as well as ensure training on safe handling, storage, and disposal of e-cigarettes to protect the health and safety of janitorial staff, teachers, administrators, and others who may be tasked with collecting e-cigarettes that are either found or confiscated at schools. This could and probably should involve connecting with local public health and waste management professionals to get an idea of what the proper handling, storage, and disposal requirements and best practices are in your jurisdiction. At a very basic level, they should include wearing gloves, storing the items in appropriate containers, i.e. not in a desk drawer, and ensuring that they are labeled properly and that they are properly disposed of with someone who is authorized to handle and transport the waste. This is a picture of just one school principal's confiscated items that, as you can imagine, could cause a lot of problems if not handled, stored, and disposed of properly. But schools and folks who work with youth, young people, might also consider using educational tools that focus, for example, on what we've talked about today. There's a lot of evidence that young people care about the environmental impacts of their actions and might alter their actions if they knew the true life cycle impacts of the products they use. But of course, as the model policy highlights, this shouldn't displace providing access to support systems, programs, and services to support cessation. If you're interested in learning more about any of the environmental problems associated with commercial tobacco, including in the school context, we have 2 publications available on our website, along with some other resources on this topic on our commercial tobacco pollution page. So with that, I'll wrap up. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me or the Public Health Law Center with any follow-up questions or requests for technical assistance. Thank you, and I think we'll be turning to questions. All right. Hopefully folks can hear me. Thanks so much for hanging around, and I'm looking forward to answering some questions. I see a couple in the Q&A, but feel free to, if you have more, add them. So the first question I see is, why is it so difficult to get farmers to switch from tobacco? It's a good question. It usually just has to do with the value of tobacco, that it's really high value crop. And so usually, it's if the value that's derived from growing tobacco kind of makes it reduces the incentive to grow really necessary crops. And that's actually one element of the framework convention on tobacco control from an international standpoint is developing policies that support farmers in switching from tobacco to other crops that are needed for food security. So it's definitely something that's kind of on the radar of the international community. And yeah, it's definitely just going to require some innovative collaboration and policy solutions at the international level. Let's see. How would you recommend disposing of disposable vapes? I am working on getting these collected in my area, but we are unsure what we will need to do once people turn them in. This is a really good question that we get a lot. I'm going to be uploading a document, hopefully if I can upload it. Otherwise, I think it's linked to in the slides that I will upload, that the Public Health Law Center has put together that has to do with disposing of vaping products in schools. It's kind of a complicated, convoluted system, depending on how much product there is and what state you're in some sense. But there are a couple elements to this. I would recommend reaching out to your local waste management people and kind of talk to them about what they're experiencing, because from what we've heard after speaking with waste management folks is that they're kind of getting overwhelmed by e-cigarettes at household hazardous waste sites. And if you're in a place like a school, you actually can't dispose of that stuff as household hazardous waste. So it's probably going to need to need to be handled and disposed of at a particular place that's set up to take these kinds of things in large volumes. So I would get in touch with your local environmental health, waste management folks, and figure out what specifically the requirements might be in your jurisdiction. We've also, there have been kind of cigarette butt cleanup days, and one of that people have asked about with respect to e-cigarettes, and one of the issues with e-cigarettes is the fact that there's like this liquid nicotine that's being leached, and it's not safe for people to just be picking those up and putting them in bags altogether. It's a fire hazard. It's a lot of really nasty chemicals and nicotine all together. So definitely don't recommend doing that. It should be collected and handled with gloves and put in individual little baggies, and then it should be stored in the right kind of way. So there's a lot of kind of moving parts to it, but they should be brought to the right kind of disposal place. Next question. What about dip tobacco? I'm not sure if that question is more has to go to goes to the environmental impacts of dip tobacco, if it, from like an upstream standpoint, or if it's more like, the downstream kind of after it's being used standpoint. We haven't dug like super deeply into dip tobacco, but I imagine, the tobacco is being grown in similar ways in similar places, depending on like the type you're getting and the manufacturer and all that. but there's still a ton of chemicals that leach out of that stuff. It's not definitely not good from an environmental standpoint. And if you're looking at crafting policies, canisters are definitely something that could be covered for reasons of. I've definitely seen shoe canisters kind of discarded on the ground. If you're trying to tackle the trash problem, I don't see a reason why not to include that in some kind of sales restriction. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see. I work for Keep America Beautiful, and could you email me? Okay, I guess that's a more personal question, but litter prevention. Just this does bring up kind of like incorporating vaping problems into litter prevention efforts. No question, cigarette butts are still going to be like the most ubiquitous thing you see everywhere, but I see vapes a fair amount, and usually they're kind of crushed after having been run over by cars a number of times, which is not good because then you have the e-waste and the nicotine is all kind of bleaching out, and definitely not ideal. So I think kind of raising awareness on that front, that vaping products are not ways to solve the environmental issue by any stretch of the imagination. I've definitely spoken to kids, kind of like youth groups, who kind of have the impression, well, I'm vaping and therefore, I'm not going to throw this on the ground. I'm going to throw it in the trash, and there's no filter, and so it's not as bad. But there's a lot of nasty stuff in vapes too. And when they do get thrown in the trash, they end up in landfills, or not in landfills. They end up, just on the street, as I said. And of course, there's still it's hard to figure out exactly where the tobacco is coming from for e-cigarettes, and we're doing some work on that. So the upstream impacts are going to be a little bit different, but it's definitely still a big concern, especially as the e-cigarette market grows, and especially since you're using such a concentrated material. And let's see. DEA e-cig disposal is a really good suggestion. DEA does have take back days in it, and then they are taking vapes. So you might want to, that's a really great suggestion. Thanks for sending that. I know they're few and far between when it's not like a super it's not something that's happening like every week or anything, but it's something helpful to keep in mind. Let's see. Someone has had people ask about American Spirit cigarettes, thinking that they're safer, or roll your own. That's really interesting. I have seen a couple just because they're kind of advertised as like natural. I've seen some advertisements that are really clearly geared towards people who are a little bit more concerned about environmental issues, or also, what they're putting in their bodies. There are no requirements for the word natural from a legal standpoint. It's arguable that kind of all the food issues aside, that could kind of imply, as you're saying, kind of like a safer product, which would not be allowed under the Tobacco Control Act. I don't, I highly doubt, even if there were a manufacturer that were touting kind of organic practices, I think the certification for that would be kind of sketchy. I would be really interested in looking into that a little bit more specifically with that brand. And I think a lot of people have issues with their marketing generally. So, and obviously they're still big tobacco. So, I certainly would not think that that they would necessarily they would be safer from like a measurable standpoint. But I would be happy to look into that. I can put my email in the chat because I'm curious about that as well. And then roll your own. Similarly, I would have to think about that a little bit more. I mean, a lot of the tobacco is really, coming from the same places. But I can't answer that like with 100% certainty for you. So I would be happy to dig into that a little bit more. Let's see. Yeah, so local waste management people, it's probably not necessarily the people who are actually picking up the trash, although I would almost think like your local, a lot of times it's your health department will have, will be able to help put you in touch with who the waste management people are, because it's usually run by the locality, while a lot of times the recycling and trash pickup might be like an independent contractor. So I wouldn't know specifically in your jurisdiction, but I think starting out with either if you have an environmental health agency or even the local health board to help figure out where those things are being picked up. If it is at a school, the school should already have management for all the things that they already do have that's have hazardous waste. So cleaning products, adhesives, like all that stuff, they have to already dispose of properly anyway. So they're probably going to know who should be picking up hazardous waste. I think it's just a matter of kind of like resetting the mindset so that it's clear that this stuff is hazardous waste. And one thing that also made me think of is when you are working with schools, one thing that we really focus a lot on is alternative penalties for students. And so if you're incorporating any kind of like waste disposal element into your school policy, it really should definitely not, penalize the person doing dropping something on the ground. It should be more about kind of norm change, education, access again to like support cessation things, just because a lot of the punitive measures just haven't been shown to work, and they're actually really detrimental, especially to young kids who are where a lot of the punitive measures are being inequitably applied anyways. So I think that's just keeping in mind equitable enforcement when thinking about school policies is really critical to doing this too. And let's see. I work with several local coalitions who wish to incorporate the promotion of youth e-cigarette cessation with the Take Back initiative. How do I direct those coalitions or support our schools in the proper way to dispose? So I would talk with the school, see if they even have a sense of like whether, that they're supposed to be disposing of this stuff in a careful way and that it's really hazardous and dangerous. If they don't, then I think it's kind of a matter of like making sure everyone's on the same page about that and sort of understanding the problem, and understanding how harmful these things are. And then it's kind of like once everyone's on the same page about that, then it's sort of how do we properly collect the stuff? How do we store it? How do we make sure that it's being transported and disposed of in the right way? So I think it might kind of depend on like where folks are at with that. The other thing about take back programs, if you're from like a cessation standpoint, is that you might be taking back full products as opposed to like used products, even though that the used products still actually have nicotine in them. They don't all the nicotine doesn't get used. So that's just keep in mind that there's likely going to be more hazardous waste when you're doing that kind of thing. But the person's point about DEA, it could be that the school, it might be worth checking into whether or not there's a DEA collection take back happening in your area, in which case the coalition might be able to help direct the take back to those folks. So yeah, I would maybe just, those are kind of the highlights I would think of. Okay. Yeah, restorative practices are just critical in any, especially, well, restorative justice in general, but with youth. Yeah, I mean, there's really punishing addiction is not going to help anyone. It's going to make the issue worse. And similarly, I think disposing of your product is kind of just a similar. It's just kind of another element of addiction. I think certainly kind of helping folks understand, like, probably don't throw your vape on the ground and run over with a car is not a good idea. Also, don't flush it down the toilet, which I've heard of people doing. I get that with kids who are, realizing that they're doing something wrong and trying to hide a product, there's like some complication there. But if they know they're not going to get, punished, especially for a first or second or even third, offense, it's more about just helping with a really strong addiction that was intentionally created by a huge industry. Then that kind of changes the likelihood of kind of trying to like ditch these things anywhere too. So thank you all for hanging around. I know it's the last session on the last day, so I think that looks like it. So, I said I would put my email in the chat here. Kira Hill, mitchellhamlin.edu. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation too, we have kind of a small team of people who I have an environmental background. I practiced environmental law before coming to Public Health Law Center. We have another person who also has an environmental background. And so we do have kind of a specific interest in this issue. So we're really happy to take your questions. You all have really good ideas. We've gotten some of the best ideas from presentations that we've given and questions that have been asked. So thanks again. And thanks to CADCA for the invitation. I got a chance to visit some of the forums and they've been really good. So thank you so much.